Welcome back, everyone. It's been a while since I've been on the channel, so I thought I would kick things off with a Q&A video, which I promised a while ago, so I thought it would be good to finally get round to that. First question on the list is from AntJ2000, who says, do you have a TBR for the last months of this year? What books are you excited about at the moment, and how do you usually choose your next book? Well, obviously it's quite close to the end of the year now, but I do have a few books that I'm interested in reading by the end of the year. I am just about to start Agatha Christie's Death on the Nile. Never read an Agatha Christie book in my life, despite the fact that I really enjoy the adaptations of Poirot, Miss Marple. Every time I don't really have a TV anymore, but when I used to have a TV, ITV3, one of those would always be on, and it was one of those things that was just forever on in the background. But I never thought to pick up an Agatha Christie book, so I decided I have a few on my shelf now, so I should probably get round to that. So that's something on my list. I'll probably read A Christmas Carol as well. I always read that at the end of the year, and I don't know if I'll have the time, but I would also like to read Wuthering Heights, as I'd like to read that in the winter. Don't always read it in the Christmas period. Sometimes I save it for the sort of bleaker January, February period, because that's just a horrible time of year. And Wuthering Heights, it might be a bleak book, but it's a comfort book for me, so I would read that at that time. When it comes to how I pick the books that I read, I don't really have a systematic way of doing this, unless I have something planned specifically for the channel. So if I'm planning to do a reader's guide, there are certain books that I want to do reader's guides on, and so those are things that I would select, and usually that is by considering how much I like a book and how well I think the book will be received. So typically that would be like a famous book like Wuthering Heights, like Dracula, something that I think, even if it's not going to get lots of interest initially, over time it's just going to be one of those videos that people will be interested in, and that's served me quite well with my Dracula and Wuthering Heights videos. But generally I just go with it. I've got lots of books on my shelf that I haven't read, so I tend to just be quite instinctive. I look at the titles, I think, do I want something heavy, do I want something light? There are some books, I'm trying to get through all of Dickens' novels, but I'm not putting myself in too much pressure to do that, because Dickens, he has a lot of books, they're all very long, so I don't want to sort of commit to just reading a Dickens novel one after another, because when you have books that big, it can be a bit of an undertaking. So I usually leave a bit of a break in between a Dickens book. I'm currently reading Barnaby Rudge for the second time, then I'll do a review of that, and then maybe early next year I'll get started on Chuzzlewit, which I think is the next book. And in terms of books that I'm excited about at the moment, well, I am excited about reading Agatha Christie's Death on the Nile. I am also excited about a book that I just finished reading for the first time, which is The Secret Garden. Now, I watched this film a very long time ago when I was a kid, and I rewatched the film partly because Maggie Smith died, and so it conjured up memories of her in that film. And so I realised I never read the book, so I thought I would read the book, and I was fascinated to see, even though the film is quite faithful in a lot of ways, some of the things that it misses. It's much more superficial, which is often the way with film adaptations, I find. But in any case, the book was fantastic, and I'll be doing a review of that on the channel very soon. Black Siren 1296 asks, you mentioned you were writing a book a while ago. Can you tell us what it is about? Yes, I have been writing a book for about 5 or 6 years now. I don't have a lot of free time to work on it, so it's been taking a while. It's gone through a lot of drafts. It began as one thing, and it's completely changed from the early days. I don't want to say too much about the book, but I usually describe it as a gender or sex dystopia, in the sense that it is a story in which the two sexes live in these completely different worlds. They don't know that each other exist. The men live in this city that is isolated, and the women live in this underground cave system that is guarded by some creatures that seem to be made entirely out of stone, and those creatures are called Boabo. And the story essentially explores a heterosexual man and woman from these two worlds who feel like they don't fit, because obviously in a world where everyone is of the same sex, being heterosexual would be the odd one. So the story basically inverts a lot of the gender and sexual norms of this world to sort of reframe it in a different way. And the story is essentially about these two finding each other, the two sexes coming together, but also dealing with the various things in their own worlds too. But yeah, I don't want to go into too much depth of the story yet, but it's something that I think I will talk about in a little bit more depth, hopefully when if I have some success when it comes to publishing. I do want to try and get this book published in the traditional way. I did actually publish a book when I was about 18 or 19 myself, and while I'm quite proud of the book itself, obviously self-publishing is hard. You don't have an editor, you don't have an ability to market things yourself. I didn't have a channel back then, and so the book's kind of just sat there, and I won't reveal what the book is called because it's part of a series that I'll probably never finish because it's just been too many years now since I wrote that. But nevertheless, it was a good learning curve, to write a book and to go through that process, and I'm hoping that it will pay dividends with this book. But yeah, that's all I'll say on my book for now. But yeah, watch this space and maybe there'll be more on that in the future. Nastiasaur7825 asks, I would love to understand how the unreliable narration works. When and how we recognise the narrator as unreliable? This is a really good question because I find that unreliable narrator is sometimes overused, not by authors, but by critics who use it to describe what's going on in a story. And I think that sometimes it's overused because it's not obvious to me that in every story, even if it's a first-person story, the author was intending for there to be a kind of unreliable narrator, or that even comes across in the story itself. It can just be over-applied, and I think it's often used as a way to allow critics to gerrymander an interpretation that they like, because if they just say, oh well, this narrator's unreliable, so we can just cast doubt on whatever they say, then it sort of legitimizes, or can be used to legitimize, the interpretation of the critic. And I think that's bad criticism, and I think that sometimes it's just not a trope that is used. Nevertheless, I think there are some telltale signs of an unreliable narrator, and I'll use Wuthering Heights as an example. When you have a story that is told within a story, and then within that you have people telling stories, you also have people reading diary entries. So when Lockwood, I want to say Lockwood, it might be Lock something else, but when he reads Kathy's diary from when she's a child near the beginning of the story, we get her perspective, and it is directly her perspective because it's the text as was written, and we see that her perspective is contradicted later by Nellie. I don't think that contradiction, it could be, but I don't think it is incompetence on Emily Bronte's part. I think it's a deliberate contradiction because she's making a point about unreliable narration, or at least she's using that technique, because you see Nellie describe things, and Nellie often talks about her own narration as being biased. She admits quite openly that she doesn't really like Kathy, that she's a little bit more sympathetic to Heathcliff. She's very sympathetic towards the elder brother, whose name escapes me right now. And so, you have this this narrator who admits that she can be very unreliable. You have these different perspectives. All of that stuff, I think, those kinds of things are telltale signs of an unreliable narrator. Another good example would be Nabokov's Lolita. Again, it's quite clear that Humbert Humbert is trying to charm the reader, trying to make him come across as a little bit less the predator that he is. He sort of wants to give off this air of, oh, I'm just a charming guy who just happens to love, prepubescent girl. Well, sort of pubescent girls, I suppose, but whatever. And it's quite clear that he's trying to charm the reader. And so I think that's how you do this unreliable narrator thing. You look for these telltale signs. You look for contradictions in what people are saying. You look to see if there are multiple narrators. That's often a good sign that there's an unreliable narrator. But I think sometimes it's just not used. And I think sometimes, and it is hard to distinguish, but I think sometimes it is just the author being inconsistent with the writing. And so one thing you can do is you could use the unreliable narrator as a sort of way to excuse the mistake. And that's fine. I mean, you don't have to interpret a text entirely in terms of how the author intended, of course. But nevertheless, I think there are cases where it's just a mistake on the author's part. It's an inconsistency. And how we tell the difference between inconsistencies and genuine unreliable narration is tricky, but I think those paradigm examples of Wuthering Heights, Lolita, those are good places to look as really good examples of that kind of thing. Next up we have 3 questions by Pierre Phillips, which I will answer one after the other rather than reading them all out because they're quite different from each other. So first we have, since more and more people are listening to audiobooks as opposed to conventional reading, what long-term effects, if any, will be on reading comprehension and analytic thinking as a whole? The mind is exercised in a different way when we read than when we listen, and do you think audiobooks will eventually replace conventional reading as the standard way to consume literature? On the replacement point, no, I don't think that is the case. Just because people have said this a lot about, they said this about the Kindle, it'll replace paper books, it didn't. Obviously this is a bit different because a Kindle is still this kind of reading, whereas audiobooks are very different. I do think that it's possible that there will be a certain group of people that are more auditory, and they will start to go to those that kind of medium. But I think there will always be a set of people who do like to just sit down with a book and focus. I do agree with your point, though, that different ways of engaging with a text does obviously mean that you take it in very differently. Now, I don't want to say this as a point to say something like one is better than the other. You know, you can listen to a book and still get a lot out of it. One thing that I will say is that for me, if I'm going to do an in-depth analysis of a book, I will always make sure that I physically read it at least once. Usually I will physically read it and listen to it, maybe. Usually I listen to it if I just want to remind myself of the general plot. But if I want to do an in-depth analysis, I need to sit there with a pen and paper. You know, going back, combing over an audiobook is a pain. I have used the bookmark feature on Audible, but I never go back and look at things, whereas it's much easier with a book to go back and read your notes. And I would say that reading the text is probably better as a rule for analytic thinking. That being said, if the important thing is less about the analysis, or that's not the only thing, the important thing sometimes is just getting people to read. And I found that I can encourage people to read a lot more if I tell them to get audiobooks. And this is especially true of older novels. The amount of people I say to, you know, if you don't like reading, try an audiobook. And they try an audiobook and they love it. And these are people who really don't like reading normally. But they find that they can listen to it and they get a lot more out of it, especially if it's got a very good narrator that brings the story to life. So for me, I would say that there are lots of advantages to audiobooks and that there's a lot of good to be found in just getting people to read, especially getting people to read older texts, because I think that in general, in media, especially the other mediums, you know, getting people to watch older films or listening to older music, all these things can be quite tricky things to do. And I think it's helpful that people do engage with the past so that they're not so focused on the present and they can see the breadth of art that's been released. And audiobooks, I think, actually are quite useful at doing that, because it can be quite hard to sit back and read Dostoevsky or Dickens, or even, you know, things that aren't that old like Virginia Woolf. But an audiobook sometimes just makes it that little bit easier. And if that's the way that you get into something, and then that means that you can then do something more analytic and serious later, go for it. So yeah, I think that there's a lot in that question, but I would say that, you know, on the whole, I think that audiobooks maybe is a little bit more superficial. If you want to understand a book, you probably need to read it physically, but that's not going to be true for everyone. Your next question is, a lot of people are very nervous about AI technology. Are you one of those people? The creative process, especially when it comes to writing and the arts in general, could be drastically changed by AI, both in the creation process of art, entertainment, along with how the industry is run. What do you think about all this AI anxiety? Well, I'm actually working on a project as part of my job that is on AI in the creative industries, focusing on visual art. So this is something that I am engaging with at the minute, and I'm doing a lot of reading, and I find a lot of it very infuriating, because not because it's polarized per se, but just because I just think a lot of this stuff is overhyped currently. And the reason why I think this is because I look at the people who think that AI is going to reshape the arts, right? And so these are the people who are positive about it. And so you would expect them to have the best examples of AI doing something great. And I was reading this paper the other day, and this person prompted AI to write a poem and to do a picture. And his point, he didn't say that it was great, but he was basically like, come on, it's not that bad. And my response to his point was, no, this is that bad. This is awful. The poem was just every single rhyme was just a one syllable word rhyme, just like coat and boat, dull and bull. These aren't actual rhymes from the poem, but you get the point. Just really dull, flat, basic rhymes, not interesting at all. That's not good poetry. Fair enough, it rhymes. Well done, AI, well done, you got the rhyme in. But if that is your example, if this is what's making you optimistic, I'm sorry, but it's a joke. The image, they basically asked for some kind of human dreamscape about the future, and the image was the most cliche bullshit I have ever seen. It was just a human head, a big human head, and out of the back of it there was like loads of weird like machinery, and the colours were all like purple and blues, all that mystical stuff that people do. It was just generic. I'm sorry, it was so cliche and it was so dull. So in my view, when it comes to whether AI is going to replace art, I just don't think so. At least not in the near future, and no one has given me an example of something that's wowed me. And I don't care if one picture has won a competition, a photography competition. To me, that doesn't prove anything. You know, there are trends, and you know there are books that sell millions of copies in a certain period of time, and they're completely forgotten in a year. So my view with art is that you have to take the long view, which is to say, come and see me in 100 years. Obviously you won't, because I'll be dead, but come and see the people who are there. And you know, has this got any longevity? That's the question. That to me is the true test of great art. Is this going to still be a thing that people think is cool in 100 years, in 1,000 years? And everything that I have seen that AI has produced so far is no. However, that's not to say that I think AI is completely worthless. I just think there's a lot of hype, and I find it very annoying when the people who profess to love it... I was at a talk by Daniel Bedingfield, another person who's on the AI train. He's a pop artist from the early 2000s, I want to say. And again, he gave examples of AI music that he thought was great, and I was sat there and I was like, this is boring to me, this is crap, sorry, but it is. But anyway, on the positive side now, AI does, in my view, have some positives. So for example, as someone who, as I said before, wrote a book when he was younger, I wouldn't want to use AI to write a book for me. I don't think it could. If you actually use it, and I have, to just to test it, to write a story, it gets confused, it makes mistakes, it's not very consistent, it's an absolute mess if you want to write a novel or even a short story. But if, say, you wanted to use it as an editor, so for example, when I'm writing a philosophy paper, if there's a sentence that just I can't for the life of me make it sound simple, I have put it into ChatGPT and said, can you make this sentence more simple, or is the grammar in the sentence correct? And it is quite good as a sort of editor. It's very good as an editor. So I think that AI has lots of different uses, and I think that what we'll find as time goes on is that it will slot into certain roles. It might to some degree replace editors, but then I don't think it will entirely, because again, AI gravitates towards the median, the average, the dull. So, you know, that's not necessarily what you want from an editor either all the time. But nevertheless, as you know, someone who's self-publishing, I think AI can be very useful, not as a writer, but as an editor, as something that can assist. So I think there are advantages to AI. I think it can be useful for certain tasks. However, I think ultimately nothing I have seen so far, and this is coming from having read so many papers of people banging on about how amazing it is, looking at the examples that they give of how amazing it is, and just being completely unimpressed by what they're selling. So that to me, that is what I would recommend as well. Don't read the negative stuff. Go to the people who think that it's great, look at the examples that they give, and ask yourself honestly, do I find this impressive or not? And if the answer is no, then I think you'll find yourself maybe having a little bit more of a measured view. So yeah, the short answer is I think it's a bit overhyped, but I think it can have its uses, and I think as time goes by, it will start, that the hype will calm down, we'll find those uses, and it will just become another tool that people use, and that'll just be that as far as I'm concerned. And the next question is, this is a non-book related topic, but you mentioned in the past that you are a fan of Joni Mitchell. What do you think of these other amazing and talented people of music? Annie Lennox, Stevie Nicks, and Susie Sue. I love all three of these brilliant icons. Well, Susie Sue is probably my favourite, one of my favourite musicians. Susie and the Banshees, I think, are a fantastic band, but I also really like The Creatures and her solo album. I wish that she would make at least one more album while she's on this planet. Nevertheless, I did manage to see her for the first time when she surprisingly toured last year, and that was a spectacular time. I think she's still a great performer. So yeah, Susie Sue, I think, is one of my favourite musicians, and someone who I listen to a lot when I'm writing. Annie Lennox and Stevie Nicks, I don't mind them. They have good songs, but they're not, Eurythmics, they have Sweet Dreams, and for me that's all they really have as a band. But to be fair, I've not really listened to them in depth, so that's less of a critical comment and more of they're just not really for me as a rule. And same with Stevie Nicks. I find that I do like her songs as part of Fleetwood Mac, but I prefer the other band members' songs pretty much consistently to her songs. So they're okay, but they're not my favourites. But Joni Mitchell and Susie Sue are fantastic in my opinion. Next question is a bit of a long one, but a good one, from Caroline Simile 49262, who asks, "Hi Joshua, thank you for your interesting video. Have you read any Henry James ghost stories? The Turn of the Screw is very good as it is full of atmosphere and is well written too. I have enjoyed your Wuthering Heights series, as I have always found the book unsettling and would only get so far and then stop reading it. Your character studies are very interesting and help me understand the book more. I hope you find your way to Bronte country. There is a vlog called Memory Seekers, and I was amazed to see a video on the walk that anyone can take, which goes all the way out to the moors and the ruin that inspired Emily. Just watching the video gives an idea of what the place was like. We visited there 4 years ago and took a different walk, but it was still amazing. Have a great week, and I will continue to listen to your other videos on the classics." Thank you for the compliments on the Wuthering Heights videos. Yeah, I really like that book, and I'm glad to see that the people also seem to enjoy them and get a lot out of them. I still haven't been to Bronte country, but I'll check out the Memory Seekers channel, and maybe that watching those videos might inspire me to finally go. It's one of those things where when you live near a place, you never do the tourist attractions. And then, you know, it's a bizarre phenomenon. I have no idea why. Because even sometimes if it's somewhere you want to do the thing, and then you finally move there and you have the opportunity to do the thing and you just don't. So it's a similar thing there when I'm home. I should really make the effort. Maybe I finally will this summer, but I probably won't. But maybe the Memory Seekers channel will encourage me. When it comes to Henry James, I did read The Turn of the Screw during my terrible first year of undergrad, where I failed at English literature and switched to just pure philosophy. And Turn of the Screw was one of the books, along with Virginia Woolf's, I'm coming at a blank, but her book about, her famous book that I can't remember, that one, not To the Lighthouse, Mrs. Dalloway. And I remember just not getting into the Henry James book. I found it very dry, I found it very slow and dull, and the stuff about it's a ghost story, right, about the governess who goes to the house, she sees the ghost children, and the interpretation is that she's meant to be sort of sexually frustrated, and that's why she has these visions. That's what I remember being discussed. I personally didn't see that, but then I also was just very frustrated at the time with my English literature course, so it's possible that just I wasn't ready to read classics when I was 18, or at least not those ones, because as I've said many times on the channel, I did end up liking Virginia Woolf later in life. Still haven't read Mrs. Dalloway, but I have enjoyed all of her other books a great deal. I haven't read any Henry James since then, but maybe I should go back and give The Turn of the Screw a chance. So we'll see if I do that. It's always hard to go back and read something that you just really didn't get on with and that brings up bad memories. Yeah, I didn't do well in English literature, which is surprising given this channel. But I think I don't know what it was. I think I was always just more interested in philosophy, at least in terms of as a way that it is assessed. I like to discuss books, I like to talk about books, but writing essays on them I always found to be quite a different beast and a lot more challenging. Angela Holmes, quadruple 8, asks, "Are you planning to do a video about season 2 of the Mayfair Witches series? And would you ever do more film reviews based on books?" In answer to the first question, absolutely not. I watched part of the first episode of the Mayfair Witches show and gave up. I thought it was a travesty. I like the book, and so to some degree I want an adaptation to be faithful in spirit, if not in terms of the plot, and it was faithful in neither sense. Getting rid of Michael Curry would be like getting rid of Ron or Hermione from Harry Potter. It's just, or getting rid of Lucy from the Chronicles of Narnia. They're kind of essential characters. They're kind of the main characters. So to get rid of them or to combine them with other characters, to me, is just already just showing a complete misunderstanding of the source material. So I wasn't interested in that. It also just didn't interest me the way it was done, and so I just ended up shutting off after the first episode. I don't think I made it through the first episode. So I won't be doing a review on that because it would be very negative. And although my review of the Vampire Chronicles was negative, I found that to be an interesting discussion topic because I do like the show independently of the books. I just think it's a bad adaptation of the books. And so that to me was an interesting perspective to put forward. When it comes to reviewing more books based on films, yes, I will do that. Although the issue with those kinds of videos is that they can be quite annoying in terms of the discussion. People tend to get very sensitive about people who read books criticising films as if they're insulting their intelligence or something because they enjoy it, and that really isn't the case. That wasn't the purpose of the Vampire Chronicles video. It wasn't about saying that the books, you need to read the books to be superior to the people who've watched the show. That wasn't the point. The point was very specific. It was, this is an adaptation of these works. Does it succeed as an adaptation or not? And my view is that it didn't. It wasn't about sneering. It wasn't about looking down on people who don't read the books. It wasn't even necessarily about which are better independently of each other. I would say the books probably are, but still, it was just about that question. But there was a lot of hostility that I found kind of annoying. And I just, it can be difficult to deal with that kind of feedback regularly. So I will still do that type of thing, but it will always be a minor thing that I do on the channel, because it can be quite fun to get sassy in the comments, but again, it can be also quite annoying to deal with hostile people who don't really seem to watch your video or understand the point that you're making. So for that reason, it can be irritating. That being said, I did have some very interesting discussions with people in the comments, even ones who did disagree. I had a nice conversation with someone about whether or not the show did a good job with the brothel scenes, whether or not they actually managed to make the analogy to using women like slaves to the original source material where they're actual slaves. I thought that discussion, I don't remember the person's username, but that was really interesting, and mostly I think that did stay fine, that conversation. And that was an interesting one, and they did make some good arguments for their case as well. So you can get some very interesting things out of that stuff, but you can also get just, people shouting, which can be a bit annoying and not very productive. Happy to have debates, so long as they, stay civil for the most part. Question from MJB276 is, will you continue reviewing The Wheel of Time, and will you do a review of the TV show? Well, I did do Wheel of Time reviews, and I read the whole series once, and then I started to read through them again, and that was when I was doing the reviews. And I actually gave up reading it, or listening to it. I was audiobooking this time. And it's not even because I don't like the books. I do, I think it's a great series. But because they're so long, I just don't want to commit for some reason. And I think I'm on book 8. I think that was as far as I got. I don't know if I reviewed the first 7 on the channel, or the first 6, or maybe even just the first 5. But I did get to book 8, and that was when, even when I was reading it, I think book 8 was one of the books that I really struggled with getting through. And so, yeah, I would like to maybe get back to that. But the Wheel of Time videos, I like doing them, but they never do that well on the channel. So I have sort of left them. I did a couple of analysis videos that also didn't have the best reception. And I don't normally think about that too much, but I do think about it to some extent. So it is sort of an issue there, where because there's so many books in the series, it's quite a commitment to then have not much feedback. When it comes to the show, I think I should review the show, but I think I would have to read the books series again to be sure about what I'm saying. Because, superficially, I have the same gut reactions that I have when it comes to the Vampire Chronicles, which is, as an adaptation, it's terrible. It thinks that Moiraine is the main character. She isn't. It thinks that the Aes Sedai are the main characters. They aren't. Rand is the main character, and that's just that, okay? Accept it, move on, he's the main character. Not in every single book, but he is the main character, and the show seems to just sideline him all the time, which I find very bizarre. I also think that they do very inconsistent things, like the Aes Sedai are very overpowered one moment and then completely underpowered the next. Like, if Moiraine can decimate a whole village, if 3 or 5, I can't remember how many women it was at the end of season 1, when they literally decimate a whole army together, fair enough, there are some sacrifices, but if they can decimate a whole army, just 5 of them, why do we even need a chosen one? I mean, that's pretty powerful stuff. So there are just things like that I find annoying. It's definitely a sort of Marvelized version of the Wheel of Time that I think is just a missed opportunity. And unlike the Vampire Chronicles, where I do like the show independently, I think that there are just inconsistencies within that show itself that make it a mediocre show at best. I hope it brings more people to the books and so on. I do worry that it won't actually end up going the full 14 books, because they take so long to make these things. And I think the actual plot of Wheel of Time in the books is over the course of a couple of years. I could be wrong, but I don't think it's very long at all. But it takes them like 2 years to do a season these days, and I'm finding this increasingly frustrating with TV shows, is the amount of time it's taking them. And it's because of all the CGI crap and all of this stuff that they're obsessed with, and all this money wasted. And I just think there needs to be a bit of going back to basics when it comes to television, a bit of scaling things back, stop being obsessed with creating spectacles, trust in people's attention spans a little bit. I don't know. I'm getting a bit sort of old man ranting, so I'll leave it there. But maybe I will review this show at some point. Maybe once there's a couple more seasons, and if I can actually bring myself to read the book series again and commit to that. Which isn't a criticism of the books, it's just because it's quite the dedication to read them all again. Same with the Vampire Chronicles. Now that I have read all those books, would I read all of them again? I don't know. I think I would read certain books, maybe the first 5 again, and then maybe pick and choose from the rest. Maybe the last 3 every now and then, and maybe Blood and Gold, and not the other ones. So, it's quite hard when you have a very long series to commit to reading it all, especially when you find yourself quite busy and you want to be able to talk about other books on the channel. Have you ever ventured into the world of Middle English literature? There are some magnificent books written from the late 1400s to the early 1800s, which range from non-fiction early medical texts, with some extreme cures for various ailments, to early science fiction, e.g. The Blazing World, which was written by the Duchess Margaret of Newcastle in 1666, where she enters into a parallel world inhabited by intelligent animal men. There's another good one called A Voyage to the Moon by Cyrano de Bergerac in 1649, where he makes a vehicle to travel to the moon and is captured by its inhabitants. There is plenty of philosophy to be had in both, if you can get a modern translation or are able to decipher the original Middle English. I am very much enjoying your channel, and I am also greatly interested in the older literature and philosophy. Well, that was an interesting comment. I love the book suggestions there. Mary Shelley is usually said as inventing science fiction, and they seem to contradict that narrative a little bit, which is fine. But they sound like really good books, so I'll have to give those a try. I haven't read much Middle English literature. I did read a translation, sort of slightly modernised version of the Canterbury Tales. It wasn't like fully modern English, it was just a little bit more clear than the original. I do have, but that did inspire me to buy the original Canterbury Tales in Middle English, which I just haven't read. I think the issue is that it can be quite difficult to get into the language, so I'm getting quite good with Shakespearean English now. I also read The Fairy Queen, which I managed to get into quite a lot. I read that twice. So those are some examples, but it's not a period that I get into that much, just because I said the English can be quite hard to get through, which isn't to say that they're bad books, they're not. It's more of a me issue than a them issue. Nevertheless, it's something that I would like to maybe do more of in the future. I think my period is probably the Victorian novel period, that sort of, 1800s to early 1900s is probably where I am. That's my thing. I find that 19th century, so 20th century stuff is good too. But yeah, I think that it's that period for me that I really enjoy. But I'll have to have a look at those books that you suggest, because they do sound quite interesting, especially if I'm doing the Mary Shelley thing, because I'll have to engage with the question of Frankenstein as science fiction. So it'd be good to compare it to some of these other examples from even before she wrote, and sort of get into those questions. That would be quite interesting. So thank you for that. I don't read much, but those are good recommendations. Alright, that is it for this video. It's nice to be back on the channel, nice to chat. I've got some videos already recorded and lined up, so hopefully I should be around on the internet for a while yet. Take care everyone. Ta-ra!